It's really important to understand that human beings have a role on Earth, that we belong here. In my language, the word for human is nahokadi intane, which means sacred Earth surface being. And when we call ourselves sacred, we acknowledge that we belong here and that we're not just accidentally here and that we actually have an ecological role. Just to remember who we are and take up that role again of being the keystone species of an ecosystem. The species that is a linchpin that upholds entire processes in the ecosystem. That we can be that again. We've done it before, we can do it again.
Welcome to the FutureKind podcast, where conscious nourishment is our guide. From the cellular to the cosmic, we're exploring how our relationship with food has the power to transform the world. Welcome, Dr. Lyla June. It is so good to have you here today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot that I want to cover with you. You describe yourself as an artist, a scholar, a community organizer, and with my focus and interest on food systems, there's so much to dive into with your PhD dissertation on Indigenous foodways. But before we get into that, I'd love to get to know you kind of at a high level. You have all these different creative outlets and pursuits and just anything you want to share about that, and specifically then how you arrived at this focus on food.
Yeah, so I've always been a creative being, I think, in the sense that I like, well, not actually painting. Don't ask me to paint. I can't paint, but but I have done a lot of sonic art, like spoken word, music, and I do love to write poetry. So that's always been my saving grace growing up. You know, life is hard, so it was through that outlet, as is the case for many artists, that we kind of stay sane, you know. But I never thought I was going to get into food research or indigenous regenerative land management and food systems. That actually came later on in life. But I've always been a person who wants to serve the creator, because luckily I had elders who trained me how to do that, and I was receptive to that kind of teaching. So I was really grateful to have elders along the way who, you know, I was just making music and like having a good time traveling the country, playing music. And this elder came to me and said, hey, you know, your people had incredible food systems that, you know, as indigenous peoples, that the history books never talk about. And they influenced the lands far greater than most of us have really been taught. And that we weren't just primitive hunter-gatherers who were just wandering around looking for a berry to eat or a deer to hunt, but we were actually cultivating intentionally and systematically the life-bearing capacity of the land. And we were from coast to coast, you know, and this isn't just a Native American thing. This is actually a human thing. We find this in the Holocene era, 12,000 years to present. A lot of stuff happened, and it wasn't all cavemen. In fact, none of it, hardly any of it was. There was very sophisticated societies doing amazing things 10,000 years ago and more. And so the Holocene era is this incredibly beautiful 12,000 years ago to today story of human beings doing way more than we understand. And this false notion that if it was in the past, then it was automatically more dumb or more primitive or more stupid. And right now, here today, we're the apex of human civilization. And it's always going to be that way, that now is always the best, you know, when in fact, I feel like today we're maybe more barbaric and primitive than we've ever been.
Yeah.
And you could argue, you know. So when my elder told me all of this, I was like, wow, that sounds like a good PhD topic. And I wanted to know what he meant, because he just gave me little hints, little sniffs of what I would then go on to research in depth for 4 years and really just devour hundreds of scientific articles about quote unquote prehistoric, although I like to say pre-colonial
Mm-hmm.
indigenous foodways. And I just found a wealth of beauty and information, not only about my own people as indigenous peoples, but about humans in general. Because if native people did it, any of us can do it, right? And like, and I started to see how we all did it in our own ancient communities of clipping the land, burning the land, pruning it, manicuring it, thinning it, selecting it, really gardening the earth on regional scales, and influencing the land in on scales that we aren't even able to do today. Um, and I'll get into more examples of that. But I really had to switch gears because even though I was having a good time playing music, the moment I felt was calling me to something else. Specifically because, you know, we're approaching a time in human history where a lot of things are collapsing, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a hard thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. The collapse of these systems, and I can't really feed people with my guitar, you know? I need to feed people with other ways. And in some ways, I can feed people with my guitar, and I do. I love to feed the spirit and feed the mind and the heart. But I also want to feed the body, and I wanted to meet the moment that was being presented to me. Because when this elder told me all this, he also said that this current food system is sort of designed to fail with the antibiotics, the vaccines, the pesticides, the herbicides. You can only keep this system afloat for so long until you create super bugs and super pests and super viruses that just knock the system out. And he said we're approaching that time. And so that's why I switched gears into food research. And now the big task is to take all of that theoretical stuff that I wrote about in the dissertation and turn it into more tangible action and implementation.
Well, I'm so grateful that you're here sharing this with us because I feel like that is part of it. I mean, I certainly will admit I had, a very high quality education, quote unquote, by our modern Western standards, and even like relatively alternative in certain ways. And this thing that you talk about in your dissertation about like the pristine myth and just like what you're speaking to of just the whole colonial erasure of indigenous foodways and the details of how pre-contact people here were pre-colonial contact people were tending the land. Like I never knew about that. You're the first person I really learned in depth about that from. So I think it's so important, and I'm excited to dive into specific examples and just like have the opportunity for all of us to wake up to that. And I'm curious, like, what would you say is like how does reframing Indigenous people as ecosystem architects challenge modern narratives about land use, conservation, and wilderness? And like, what does that shift in understanding make possible that's maybe not when we have this really erroneous idea of that doesn't respect the role that Indigenous people have played in actively tending and shaping the land?
Wow, I love that question. How does understanding that Indigenous peoples were ecosystems architects, and how does that change the way we look at conservation and wilderness? I could like rant on that for a long time, but I will spare you and I'll just do a brief answer. but it's a big thing, and I'm so, and it's an exciting thing, and it's a nourishing thing for all races of people. It doesn't matter where you're from. This is exciting news for all of us. But before I jump into that, I forgot to introduce myself in the traditional way, so I'm just going to do that briefly, just to
Yeah,
honor
please.
my ancestors.
Thank you.
So She'e Nanisht Ejitrachitni Nshle. I'm from the Nanisht Ejitrachitni clan of the Diné Nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo, but our true name is Diné, which means the people in our language. Navajo isn't even from our language. But that happened to all the tribes where they were just labeling them a bunch of random names. And that was part of the erasure of the real names and the real people and the real spirit of what we stood for. But anyways, that's my clan, Nanisht Ejetrachitni, and I get that from my mother. We're a matrilineal people. My other clans are Tsitsesis or Southern Cheyenne, Ashihe or the Salt Clan, and Bilagana or the White People Clan, which is my father's father, which is Scottish. So I just wanted to honor those rivers, that those clans that flow together to make me who I am. And I didn't know those clans when I was born. I had to find all of them. I had to research and figure out. But I did know elders who could teach me how to trace my lineages. So that was good. So going back to your question, so the concept of wilderness is sort of like it rubs people the wrong way, which you wouldn't think, right? Wilderness sounds good. It's like a positive thing. But when you look at wilderness, it kind of denotes that it's never been touched by humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this pristine myth that, like, when Europeans got here, the United States was by and large terra nullius, or no man's land, right? Just a vast open wilderness with a few scattered bands of nomads running around, but nothing consequential, right? And that is the part that I'm trying to, not just me, but many scholars, this has been written about 1,000 times over. You know, it's very clear in the record that the United States was home to really dense populations of indigenous peoples who sculpted and managed the land extensively. So when we understand that indigenous peoples are architects of edible ecosystems, right? Not just little farms, not just little oyster farms, but managing whole estuaries, stewarding whole grasslands. For example, the easiest example is the chestnuts, which grew from Maine down to Georgia and supported huge populations with their caloric base and their nutritional offering that they gave not just to humans, but to all kinds of animals. And so at first, everyone thought those chestnuts, and by everyone, I mean white folks, everyone thought those chestnuts were just wild, just naturally occurring, quote unquote, chestnuts that were just there. But now we can look through fossilized pollen analysis and the fossilized pollen record that's at the base of every pond in the East. You could take out a soil core and look at the vegetation history of all these areas around the ponds. We can see super clearly that these biodiverse food forests were planted there, specifically one in Kentucky around 3,000 years ago.
Wow.
It's really clear. There's like no chestnut pollen, and then there's chestnut pollen for 3,000 years. Black walnut pollen comes in 2,000 years ago. Hickory nut comes in with the chestnut, and all these other edible species like sunflower, goosefoot, sumpweed come into the record seemingly out of nowhere, along with fossilized charcoal, which indicates that indigenous peoples were managing this biodiverse food forest of widely spaced nut trees with routine burning of the forest floor, because that would eliminate competing vegetation. It would bring the ash back into the soil. It would generate nutrient-dense meadows in between the trees, which would attract the deer. Like, we had a whole system going on. We had a whole thing about how to keep these ecosystems really lively and healthy and supportive, not just of humans, but of all life, because that was our mandate, to take care of all life. So that's just an example of how it changed. When your piece about conservation, right? And I'll end with this, is that we often see like two options, like conservation, where we just draw a line around a place and never touch it, right? It's sort of like, this is nature. You're not allowed here. You can walk on this trail, but don't go off the trail, you know? And then there's exploitation is the other extreme, where you're just ransacking the earth without any apologies, and just very explicitly trying to maximize profits off the earth, right? Like, not even trying to hide it. Like, I am mining silver and I'm tearing apart the mountains to get it, right? Like, so there's there's those two, and we think those are the only two options. Either
Mm-hmm.
leave it alone or harvest from it as much as you can, as quick as you can. But we don't understand Indigenous peoples did something in the middle where they honored the land, they took care of the land, but they were in there. And we still are in many cases where we've got our sleeves rolled up, we're in there, we're clipping, we're pruning, we're burning, and interestingly, we're harvesting. That's the very fascinating thing about Mother Earth is she needs us to harvest from her so she can be healthy. For example, a forest that gets too overcrowded, all those trees are going to compete with each other and suck up the limited nutrients in the soil and fight with each other over the limited water in the water table. And they actually, something, whether it's humans or something else, needs to come in and thin that forest. Take, not all, don't clear cut it, but take some stuff out of it to build our homes, to build our lodges, to build our canoes, to build our bows. Everything can come from that timber. And so that middle path I call co-creation, not conservation, not exploitation, but co-creation, where we are working with Mother Earth to create things together, and we're not omitted from the puzzle. We are an integral piece of the puzzle of the ecosystem.
Beautiful. I'm really curious, imaging that and thinking about it, like what the shift in mindset that informs, and just like a way of being that informs that co-creative approach compared to like what is the mindset that makes it where we could only see that we're either like have to tread really lightly or like have a right to just totally exploit. And it seems like there's the fundamental part of it of remembering our belonging to nature. And like you're saying, like wilderness can include humans, like we're part of the body of the earth, we're part of nature. But there's also like, in order to be trustworthy in that, in order to like truly like be allowed and allow ourselves to be the part of nature that we are, there is a mindset shift. And you talk in your dissertation about kincentric ecology. And I feel like that's such a beautiful way to capture this, like the difference between the Indigenous perspective that allows for co-creation and the colonizer mindset that either, I mean, I just think it's an interesting thing to notice, like as a white person who like had a lot of values for a lot of my life around, you know, this pristine myth and wilderness and an idea that like humans are just messing things up. Like once I became awake and really concerned with the exploitation, then I was one of those people. I was like, well, the alternative is like, you know, maybe we need way fewer humans and we should just like back off and get away. And so I feel really inspired by what you're sharing and just by the wisdom of this Indigenous way of kincentric ecology, and feel like it's such an important thing for people like me to be learning about, and would love to hear you speak to like what that is. What is that approach to living and understanding?
Yeah, it's really important to understand that human beings have a role on Earth, that we belong here, which is really hard for people to believe when they look around at the Western expression of human settlement, where it's pollution and war and it's just not looking very pretty, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many examples around the world and throughout time where we as human beings were regenerative, that we were so good to the earth that we added value to her health, that we added value to her biodiversity, that we added value to the health of her soils. Just look at the terra preta of the Amazon. We're talking 3 to 4 foot deep black topsoils that owe their existence entirely to human beings. Like that topsoil would not exist without thousands of years of indigenous soil management through, you know, burning their crop residues in their field so that that ash goes back into the soil, you know, bringing in old termite mounds as inputs, planting crops very carefully and timing the crops so that the nitrogen fixing ones are doing their job. And even within a field, you're having multiple subspecies of the same type of I mean, it's just incredible the amount of precision that, for example, the Mebengokre of Brazil have in terms of managing their fields and their soil production. And when you look at a map of the Terra Preta or Amazonian dark earths, this sort of phenomenon, scientists have researched to pieces, of where we find those in the Amazon, it's littering the entire map. There's just black dots everywhere. And I love to show that map to people to see, like, look at how much human beings have influenced the very foundation of the entire Amazon River basin. Like, we did that. Like, that's so cool. And human beings were so good to the earth that when they were removed take the chestnuts, for example, when they wiped out close to 98% of the indigenous peoples in the East, mostly due to disease and other factors, the whole chestnut grove from Maine down to Georgia went into shock. And you have now the chestnuts are almost completely extinct because that gentle fire, that human management, that spacing, that pruning, that selecting older trees that were sick that needed to come out, that went away. And the trees got a blight, and the blight wiped out the American chestnut. It's one of the great American tragedies, or Turtle Island tragedies, is that, without those human hands that were so regenerative and so vital, essential, the chestnuts went away. And so that's what I'm really trying to show people too, is that, again, there's this binary of like, either humans are like the best and we're like the apex of all creation and we're so important, or we're just like pests and we're just like a problem. And if we could just remove all the humans, everything would be better. And that is something I'm also pushing back on, is saying, no, in my language, the word for human is nahokadi, which means sacred earth surface being. And when we call ourselves sacred, we acknowledge that we belong here and that we're not just accidentally here, and that we actually have an ecological role. And the word for human being in Yoruba, a West African language, is the chosen one. Not because we were chosen to dominate the earth, but because we were chosen to steward the earth. And so it's super exciting to see ways in which humans can remember that we're not bad. There's so much shame that we feel just for being human, and I don't want us to feel that anymore. Like, yes, there are certain systems and, like you said, mindsets that are toxic to the earth and to ourselves, but we're also capable of housing beautiful mindsets and beautiful worldviews and beautiful value systems. And that happened from Alaska down to Patagonia and worldwide. And so just to remember who we are and take up that role again of being the keystone species of an ecosystem, the species that is a linchpin that upholds entire processes in the ecosystem, that we can be that again. We've done it before, we can do it again. It can take some trial and error, and we're going to hit our heads against the wall a few times. And it seems like maybe from a suburban American kid's point of view that like there's no hope for our species, but you're just in a tiny part of a long geological history of human evolution, earthly evolution, and we do evolve, we do learn, and we will get better. It might be messy and ugly and even bloody in the process, but it is going to be okay. And we are capable of learning, and my people are a proof of that. So the last thing I'll say on that is that the mindset that generates the conservation or exploitation binary, you have to have compassion for Europeans because they went through a 2,000 years of open warfare before Columbus was ever born. We're talking bubonic plague. We're talking witch burnings. We're talking the Inquisition. We're talking the Roman expansion, which was nasty. We're talking all manner of prohibition of indigenous European languages, right? It was illegal to speak Welsh, Scottish, or Irish in the British Isles for a long, long time. And there were punitive measures in place to punish children who ever spoke it in school. So you have to understand, when you're in open warfare for 2,000 years, there is a scarcity mentality that is generated because you don't know if you're going to have tomorrow. You got to get what you can right away, right? And because you might not have a chance tomorrow. So we have to have compassion for the intergenerational trauma that we carry as European peoples, and how that sometimes can create these paradigms that need to be debugged, of the fear, and debugged of the division, and debugged of the um, feelings of insecurity, and then which lead to domination behaviors. And we need to have compassion and also hold ourselves to higher standards, because we can heal from that.
Hmm. I love all of that. I think holding ourselves to higher standards and taking responsibility for that. And I really appreciate the way that you invite in consideration for multiple lineages and like the truth of like all of us, no matter our race, like we all have ancestors who are indigenous somewhere to the earth, and we have this capacity to remember what it is to belong. And like, I think as a white person, like I've often felt an obstacle to having a vision. Like, so there's everything you just said. And then there's like, well, then, and when all of that trauma gets turned into perpetuating that on other people, then there's also the guilt. And that for me as a white person has often like, you know, I've unpacked a lot of this at this point, but like in my own reflections, just experienced how, I kind of like, it's a further reason to erase myself out of belonging and connection, like that guilt, that sense of like, not only look at what humans have done, look what white people have done, like, oh, that's beautiful that indigenous people on Turtle Island had these ways, but that's not part of my way. And I think that that remembering, like for all of us, part of taking responsibility for all of that trauma and disconnect and for the role that we play as humans is to acknowledge it and also to like have the courage to see ourselves back into belonging. Like that's part of taking responsibility. Like hiding in the fear and the disconnect and the trauma isn't helping anyone or anything. So I just appreciate you holding all of those lineages, and also the history lesson that I think a lot of people aren't well grounded in, of like the European piece of that history lesson too. Like where did like the colonial mindset of domination and exploitation come from? Like it's valid, and we need to move past that, and we can move past that. So
Right.
thank you
And
for
I've
sharing
done a
that.
lot of work. Yeah, you're welcome. I used to pretend like I wasn't part European, because in my family, like, oh, they're the bad guys, right? They're the ones who did colonization and slavery, da, 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 which we did. There's no getting around that. And we have to, like you said, we take accountability for that, but take accountability for it within proper context. So I actually went back to Europe, to research my homelands, to feel the land, and to really feel the ancestors who went through some horrific things. And what helps me explain to, I'll say us as white folks, because I could put on my native hat or my white girl hat either way, but like, we have to understand that everything that was done to indigenous peoples in what we now call America was practiced first on the indigenous peoples of Europe. Everything from relocation, right? The Romans used to relocate people, to systematic abuse of the women, right? If you could bring down the women, you could bring down the whole thing. That's how it's always been. And the Romans knew that, right? And whoever did it to the Romans, I don't know. And you have to understand that it's just an immense amount of trauma that gets passed on. And that isn't an excuse, and that doesn't allow us to continue it. But it helps us have compassion for ourselves. Compassion and understanding. It's something that we don't have enough of in this world. And for me, for example, I started doing drugs when I was 11 years old. I started to drink when I was 12. By the time I got into Stanford, which was a miracle in and of itself, I was a full blown alcoholic. And I was like basically a menace to society. Like I was not a good influence for the students around me or for anyone. But when the elders finally found me, they didn't say, "Oh, you're a bad girl. You've been, being a bad influence on the people around you. You've been stealing stuff. You've been lying. You got to go to jail." They said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry you grew up in a place where drugs and alcohol were all around you. I'm sorry you grew up in a community of drug dealers. I'm sorry that you experienced the abuse of your body from a very young age." They were just like, and I was so confused because I'm like, "No, I'm bad. Don't you know I'm bad?" And
Mm,
they're
mm,
like, "No, you're actually not bad. You are innately good. And it takes a lot of trauma to bend and distort and break an innately good being into something that is harming itself and others." So it's almost like the more trauma you might inflict on others, the more you have been through, because you can't really do that unless you've been very, very bent. So, yeah, and forgiveness. There's some things that were just mistakes. There's no excuse, there's no explanation. And that's where grace comes into play, which is this crazy thing, right? Of just loving each other through all of our flaws and all of our BS, and just saying, "You know what, even though you did this and this and this, I love you, and I forgive you." And that's the kind of medicine that I think the earth really needs right now. And that's the kind of medicine that breaks cycles.
You've spoken a handful of times about the important role that your elders have played in like supporting you in that grace and coming back into love. And I'm curious what else, for you, like what other practices or resources help you with all of the trauma you've experienced step into the level of responsibility that you're taking for like being in good relationship and working from a place of love. Because I think a lot of people in their own ways and stories like can relate to this experience of a life where a lot of trauma has been perpetuated, and like how do we remember our way back into our innate goodness. Yeah, what does that look like for you? Where do you draw strength from? And maybe like for people who don't have elders, like what might that look like?
One thing that's really helped me is researching my roots. Um, and I think that would apply to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Um, no matter who you are, there's so much fascinating stuff back there. Like I went to these caves in France recently where they had 17,000-year-old paintings of bison and horse and
Mm-hmm.
ibex and pregnant women. And I was like, my mind was just blown. And these weren't like little stick figures. These were gorgeous. Like, and my little friend who was with me, he said, "Lyla, if these people were so stupid, why can they draw better than us?" And I was, because like they use like the three-dimensional curvature of the cave walls to like have the bison head like come out a little bit, and like
Oh,
it's
wow.
just really, it's like the Mona Lisa of bison, just this little like tiny features that are just, it's just breathtaking. And um it was just so interesting to see how like that's who we are, people who used to go down and way into the cave, and
Mm.
just honor life. Like that's who we are. We're crazy like that in a good way. And I really loved seeing that, because it kind of points to our innate goodness, which I think a lot of people try to say is contrary to what we are, that we're innately bad. But I think that the coyote spirit that's always, you know, upset with creation, upset with creator, and since it can't hurt creator, it does the next best thing where it hurts creation. And it's just always on our back, just applying pressure, creating trauma. and this spirit was supposed to help the earth and be a guardian of the earth, but now it's like using all its power to enslave the earth. And that coyote spirit really is something that we have been evolving under the pressure of that for so long. We have to give ourselves a little grace and understand that there's only so much we can do as humans, who have the psychological child psychology that we do. You know, even the smallest thing that happens when you're from 0 to 3, your formative years, can have huge impacts for the rest of your life. And Coyote knows that. I mean, how are we supposed to compete with that? It's just like all these children going through war right now. They're never going to be the same. I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
might through miracles, but if those resources aren't put in there, um, it can really have a hard time. So, going back to your question, though, I think that the thing that helps me is researching my roots and really understanding who I am, and going to those sacred sites. You know, let's say you're a Portuguese, half Portuguese and half Choctaw, you know, and you're growing, or you're half African descent and half, Blackfeet from Montana or whatever. You know, there's so many amazing mixtures of people in the world today. Or maybe you're part Filipino and part Hawaiian, and like, there's just so much beauty in all of that. You know, there's just so, and learning our languages, learning our ancient languages, or even our traditional languages. And you might think, well, there's nothing there to find. It's been so destroyed. Well, I don't think so. Because when I went to Europe, I found the old wheel that they used to take time with. And each time of year had a tree that was the representative of that time period for that season. And there was like the ash and the apple and the yew tree, and I was like, whoa, this is still here. You know, our knowledge, our compass, our old compass of how to live, even if it wasn't perfect, there's still beauty to draw from that and give us strength. And going to those sacred sites, you know, I went to some rock, sort of like natural rocks that were stacked on top of each other, like naturally, in England. And there's pools on top where the rain collects. And I did a ceremony there with the women from England as the full moon was rising and the sun was setting. And I'm like, I felt that power of the earth and of the ancestors and of creation. And I think the more we can, like, I had a friend who was Mayan, and he went back to the Maya Riviera, which is now very touristy, and, you know, Cancun, but there's still those ancient temples there, you know, and he went to that temple and it made him come alive. And so I think those are the things that I would suggest for anyone, is like, go back home, not just geographically, but intellectually, um, spiritually, emotionally, and find those roots so that you have something to stand on, or rather you see what you've always been standing on all along.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Other than that, I would just really suggest to people to love each other and love themselves. Self love is such an art that is, for some reason, really hard to master, because we're all ashamed of something. We did this wrong, and we're not good enough here. Da, da, da. And to me, healing has been finding those places where I don't like myself, and transforming it into having grace for myself, while still improving, of course, but um, and just loving myself, and allowing Creator to inhabit me, and giving Him permission, and knowing that I'm worthy of that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think everyone could benefit from just a healthy dose of self-love and self-forgiveness, and taking those burdens we carry off of our shoulders, because they're not really helping us or anyone else.
Those ideas seem really related when I reflect on my own lived experience. That, like, in my experience, my capacity for self-love is directly tied to the degree to which I am remembering my belonging to something bigger, which can start, like you're saying, with like remembering our ancestors, our lineage, and all of this. Like, I'm thinking about the relationship with this whole conversation and food. And like even the whole reason for doing this podcast, like I've been working on the food system for 20 years. And the thing is, like, until we change our mindset, so like, I don't know, people might be listening, like, why are we talking about this on a food podcast? It's like, because until we shift our mindset at the most foundational level, like shift our paradigm that we're living from separation and isolation into interdependence, we're not going to be able to transform our food system in the way that we need either. It's like every facet of life reflects this fragmentation, like that woundedness, the fear, the difficulty loving ourselves, like all of that comes from an illusion of separateness. And so I think the things you're saying about remembering our place, like over time and space of our belonging, like if we can really do that, then like how does that change how we think about food? And I think this is where, like obviously our current food system, the majority of calories, at least in the West, they come from the commodity processed food system. And, that's where my work has been squarely situated. And I'm really curious, like, I'm like in my mind trying to bridge this image of like the indigenous tending of the chestnuts and this like beautiful right relationship with foodways, and then like the gap between that and our current food reality. And I'm curious, like, what do you see for how we close that gap? I do think there's a really foundational thing of like maybe we can't see every step in a linear way, but just knowing that like the first step certainly is to remember that everything is interdependent. And so then like what does that mean for how we make and share our food? But it just feels like there's a lot to be learned about indigenous foodways in terms of like how we shift our mindset and how we repair our relationship to the way that we're growing and sharing food. And I'm curious what thoughts you have about all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I also was seeking like a technological fix or a like a mechanistic fix of like, oh, if we all just do this, everything will be better. But as I researched more and more into these case studies of indigenous regenerative food systems, it took me like 3 years of research to realize I was kind of looking at the wrong thing.
Mm,
That it's not how these societies created their food. That is important, but perhaps more foundational and more important is why they created these food systems. And the reason why they created them was because they felt a responsibility to their homeland. They felt their identity was that they were warriors for all life around them, that they
mm,
were almost every tribe you talk to. I'm not even making this up. Any Native person listening to this can back me up. Almost every tribe you talk to says, Creator put us right here to take care of this homeland. That this is our, almost like our divine assignment. That
mm,
this is where we were put to make sure everything's healthy, that the water's clean, that the salmon are doing okay, or the buffalo or the chestnuts or whatever it is. We're here to be the warriors for all life. And that is actually, I think, what's going to fix us more than some technological fix or some like, oh, this is how you repair soil, or this is how you create, like, regenerate the oyster beds, or like, like those are important. Yes, don't get me wrong. But if you handed that chestnut grove to a capitalist, for example, do you think it would have lasted 3,000 years? Maybe so, maybe not. Probably not, because their goal is short-term profit, right? Their raison d'être, their reason for being, is to maximize profits for the near term. And to, the whole spiel, maximize shareholder value and all that jazz. So they're not really designing for perpetuity. They're not designing the system to last forever. That's not really, they can't see that far. They will, they're about to, when it all collapses, they're like, oh, whoops, we maybe should have planned things a little differently. But it's, so I started to see the human as having software and hardware. So the hardware is our muscles, our bones, our eyes, our brains, our hearts, every part of our body. And then the software is the language that we speak, the value system that we live by, the worldview, the program that our hardware operates from. It's like our operating system, right? And that worldview is just as influential, if not more, than our hardware. In fact, much more, because that's the thing that steers the human body to do what it does. And so that software used to be, and in many cases still is, carefully gardened. And that through stories, through coyote stories where we would learn what not to do, through the manhood ceremony, the womanhood ceremony, through like if you look at the Anishinaabe, they have the 7 grandfather teachings that guide their entire world. And those are honesty, humility, generosity, truth, and there's 3 more that I can't think of. But if you just Google Anishinaabe 7 grandfather teachings or Ojibwe 7 grandfather teachings, they're the same, 2 different names for the same tribe. You'll see that this is what they were responsible for teaching the next generation. If there was anything they were going to pass on, it was these 7 things, these values. And it helped their communities thrive for thousands of years in the Great Lakes region. And they were just kicking butt and taking names, like growing tons of wild rice that fed everyone. And like, they're still doing it. It's amazing, even with everything they've been through. So, and when you go to their communities, those 7 grandfather teachings are there in all the classrooms and all the coffee shops. It's so amazing. That is the software that runs the whole nation. And so, to me, closing the gap, I wish I could say it was just a recipe of actions we could take. But ironically, it's not about what we got to do out there in the world. It's about what we got to do in here, in our hearts and in our minds. And that's the shift that makes me feel like no matter how many good ideas we have about regenerative soil management or this or that, until we switch from being a giver to the earth from a taker, I don't know if we can be helped. And that's a toughie, right? Because like, oh yeah, all we got to do is get rid of all the greed in the world. It's like, that's hard, right? But I really do think that's the crux of it. And one thing we do have on our side for getting rid of all the greed is that greed is unsustainable. It always collapses in on itself. It always like doesn't get it might last a couple centuries, like Rome, and then it'll collapse. It just it doesn't work. So everything we're seeing now, the exhaustion of soil, the pollution of all the water systems, and I'll end with this because I know I've been rambling a bit. The collapse of our banking systems, of the wars, etc. These are really just symptoms of something that's been broken for a long time. And now it's all finally coming to pass, right? The proverbial crap is hitting the fan. But it's not like 2024 is now all of a sudden something's gone wrong. Something has always kind of been wrong. And we're just finally seeing the consequences of what happens when you treat the earth like a slave. You can't do that. It's not going to work. It might work for a little while, but it doesn't work in the long run. So it's usually through that collapse that I've seen Native American civilizations learn a lot and become better people. Because we went through collapse too. Chaco Canyon collapsed. The Mound Builders collapsed. Mayan folks collapsed. And each of those collapses were integral to our learning of what doesn't work. And that's how we became so cool. Was not because we were born this cool, but because we went through trial and error to learn what works and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm. And I want to tie that back to what you're saying about the shift of like, there isn't like an external thing, but an internal thing. Because as I'm listening to that last part, I can recognize like the tendency I've had in the past to like, you can look at this system and be like, well, the definition of unsustainable, which we all know this is unsustainable, it means it's going to end, it's going to fall down. And it's another place, though, where I can fall prey to seeing myself as like outside of and separate from. It's like I'm over here watching that messed up situation. And so I'm like curious in that, just with what you're saying about like the personal accountability to look within, that as all that's happening, like the opportunity for each of us every day, whatever our work lives look like, whatever our life circumstance, to have practices where even if it's just reflection, and I'm curious, if you have thoughts on what this might look like, but just simply having the intention on a daily basis to remember that we are powerful co-creators, and how we show up in this day and whatever, again, like, I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of people listening to this podcast who work within the retail commodity food system, and still we have power to transform. And still, even within that, like, how in this day can we remember our belonging and just like remember the power of, like, even if you can't see exactly how that connects through to this, again, like the vision of the chestnut, which you brought alive so vividly and beautifully, like, like there's a big gap between that and the way we're living. But I think it starts with just each one of us remembering that we're powerful co-creators, that we belong, that our choices matter, and that we're not separate from any of this. So what does that mean? And it takes a lot of strength and courage to do that. So I would love if you could leave us with any other thoughts of like, where do we find that strength and courage? And I feel like this kind of almost brings us full circle also back to your work as a musician. And you said how like, well, I don't feed people with my guitar, but maybe I do a little bit. Just the way that like music, art, poetry, stories, that aliveness of creativity nourish our souls and can like spark that will to keep coming back to doing the work of like, how do I transform within in service of the change that's needed? You just embody this in so many dimensions. And so like, whether it's related to your scholarship or your music or your poetry, just any final thoughts that you want to leave us with of how we keep doing this good work of becoming the humans that the future needs.
Yeah, you asked such good deepening questions, because you are right. You can easily be like, oh, the empire will collapse. While it's so clear that we are definitely part of the empire, we're complicit, like we're still, and I think we do still have to have compassion for ourselves, because we weren't really given any other manual of how to live except for this suburb. Many of us listening, not everyone by any means. A lot of people are like already ahead of the game and we need to follow their leadership. But a lot of us, including myself, even as an Indigenous woman, I didn't know this history about my people. I grew up eating all my food from the grocery store. I grew up relying on fossil fuels to get from one place to the other. Like, I'm a daily consumer of things that are harvested from the earth in very disrespectful ways, right? And I think that's where we get to the point where it's like, okay, here we are. We weren't given any other really way to live, but where can we start? And I just am such a big believer of starting small and then taking that thread and seeing it where it leads you. Whether it's localizing, certain type of production of this essential societal need, or it's even like I'm starting a Food Warriors Fellowship where we're just helping kids start to grow food for their communities, even if it's like one little tomato garden. Like, I don't care. I'm just trying to get people starting, And I think those small steps are how we get to the big steps. And then you have other people who are in extremely powerful positions, like in the FDA. I mean, there's so much that could be done from the top-down side of things, right? Like incredibly far-reaching things that could change if the top, quote unquote, would implement some policies that actually made sense. But the good news is we're so much bigger than the elite corporations who control the food system. We're so much more numerous. We outnumber them 100,000 to 1. Like, we got this. And if each of us do our small part to reclaim our food systems and to do it for those right reasons, the software, those value systems that are about being a warrior for people, being a warrior for the earth, a peaceful warrior, of course, but someone who really gets in the trenches and fights for the good of the earth and humanity. I think we'd be surprised how many hands make light work. And when we work together, we can effectuate incredible change, and we can change the world. That's how it's always been changed in the past. It's how it's going to be changed today and tomorrow. And so just remembering our power. And I think too, just understanding that we have, even though I was harping on the software, there are a lot of tools available to us. Seeing the land more as a holistic watershed, right, is a big thing. Seeing it as a bioregion and collectively working, I think behind the leadership of Indigenous peoples, ideally. Grassroots female usually is ideal, like women, Indigenous leaders who are not a part of the tribal business council or whatever that stuff is, but who are really on the ground, following their leadership to steward land in a holistic way, right? Which private property has made really hard. But that's one of the tools I think we can do, is collapse all these private holdings into holistic management cooperatives where we work together to look at the watershed together. That's going to be a leap that I think we're going to have to take at some point. And the other tool is to really support Indigenous land back, support Indigenous food warriors, and to continue to research, to learn. And I can't stress enough, I should have said this at the beginning of the call, to pray. Prayer is the only reason I'm sitting here today. And I would say it's a miracle, and it is, but it's also like, that's just what Creator does. Creator's freaking like amazing. And a lot of people don't trust Creator, right? Because how could there be a Creator if the world is like full of so much pain and misery? Well, that's not Creator. We're doing that through a lot of coyote spirit influence, right? But that was never the goal for this planet. If you look back at those cave paintings, like that was the goal, and it can still be the goal. But to remember, Creator isn't doing all this, but also Creator gives us free will to both hurt people and hurt ourselves, unfortunately. But otherwise, we just would be robots, and we wouldn't learn anything. We wouldn't grow. And so it's this sort of like challenging planet Earth we live on, where we have this free will to like take the wrong road and the right road equally at every moment. And our free will can change at any moment what we decide. And to honor that the Creator is not there to hurt us or to watch us suffer. Creator is waiting for us to reach out to him or her or whatever it is you pray to. And that Creator wants to help. And sometimes it's only looking for an invitation. And I think people like you, people like me, we're very smart. We have a lot of capacity, but we don't have to rely on our own abilities alone, thank God. Like there's something bigger that will help us see the visions, to see the solutions, to be a part of the solution, and just keeping that prayer alive and asking Creator on a daily basis, if you can, help me see how to reduce plastic pollution. Help me see how to localize the food system here. Help me see how I can be a helpful, and you'll be amazed how that prayer is answered, because Creator always knocks it out of the park. I mean, just like you'll give him this little prayer and it'll just come back like 50-fold. And you're like, oh, wow, I didn't even see that one coming, but Creator's awesome like that. And it's so much more bigger than we are. And so when we invite that being and all of the ancestors that work for that purpose into our lives, amazing things can happen. So even if you don't believe in the Creator, whatever you believe in, maybe pray to a tree if that's what feels good. Just ask something, like, because you could even just say, if anything's out there, can you please help me? Even that prayer is going to get answered from my experience. And just, even if it's a small influence, that's another thing I'll say is like, I used to want to like be the next Nelson Mandela, and then creators like, well, maybe you're just going to help this lady at the cashier desk today, and like to be okay with just that, quote unquote, like, so the prayer I was taught is in the morning, you say, may I help at least one person today? Then that humility of just like, even if I get that opportunity, like being grateful for that. But you have that clause in there, right? At least. So you never know. It might be like a billion people, or, and when we open ourselves up to that power and that beauty, so much can come through. So I have no idea if I even answered your question. I apologize. But I do want to say that food is sacred. It's not a noun. It's a verb. It's our direct connection to Mother Earth. Food is the medium through which we relate to the earth. And so you're right. It's not just about food. It's about so many things. It's not just about food alone. It's about our heart and why we get out of bed every day, why we step into the field every day, why we step to our work every day. Like, food is what allows us to do that. And food is what is a dynamic set of processes. Everything from rain to wind to germination to mycelium to microbes to the microbes in our gut that help us digest. Food is so much bigger than this discrete little noun. It is everything. It's our very existence. And so honoring it as sacred rather than as something you throw to your kid in the backseat because they're hungry and you just want to get them to shush, right? Like, but it's how everything gives their life every single day so that we can live. If that's not sacred, I don't know if I would be brave enough to give my life right now, Megan, so you could live. I probably would, but it would be hard, and that's what our relatives do for us every day. They give up their bodies, they give up their fruit. And so therefore the question is, how are we going to give back to them? Because they do that every day. And I think it's really exciting to think about how we as a species are going to meet that with reciprocity, respect, reverence, regeneration, relationality, and restraint, not taking too much. So yeah, I think those are the words I would end on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyla June. You are an inspiration. I hope to continue the conversation, and we'll put information in the show notes with links to find out more about some of the things we've been talking about, and also to check out Dr. Lyla June's music, which you can also find on Spotify at Lyla June. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on FutureKind. Remember, every choice we make ripples through the web of life. Until next time, stay curious, stay conscious, and keep making FutureKind choices that nourish yourself and our world. FutureKind is brought to you by the Non-GMO Project and the Food Integrity Collective. New episodes emerge with every new and full moon. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform and share your FutureKind moments with us on social media using #FutureKind. Music by Yaima, Masaru Higasa, and Pepper Proud. Rise Ceremonia 6. We close this episode with Water is Life from Lyla June's new album. This song is a reminder of the sacred relationships that sustain us all.
He said it's not a song, it's a way of life. It's a forever thing, it's a message. He said you can say that water is life. You can sing it again and again, but will they listen? Are we gonna stand by these words? Are we gonna find a way to change the way we're living? Mother Earth, she feels everything and it hurts. moon like the body of a woman, she's changing. Can we return to the times when water was alive, when we prayed at her edge and gave thanks for this life, when the water fell from the sky and we drank from her bosom, when the water fell from our eyes and the water fell from our arms, when it rose up to the surface and we knew every spring, no fear or competition, just a relative to a face. We are people of the sun, we are people of the water. We will celebrate our sons, we will celebrate our daughters, give them ceremony so when the drought comes they'll be ready. Will the next war be for water? All our solutions are part of the problem, can't win war with war. There is more than one creation story. Worlds have died and worlds have been reborn before. When you touch the water, you touch the world. From Taos Peaks to Gulf Streams, the memories they hold. We sell her by the acre foot, treat her as our captive. The rivers are undrinkable while the aquifers extracted. Our food will need water to grow. Do you have to take it all? We try to hold her and control her as we watch our empire fall. He said it's not a song, it's a way of life. It's a forever thing, it's a message. He said you can say that water is life. You can sing it again and again, but can you live it?
Watching, hoping, praying that this time it becomes pollen, as done by their grandmothers, grandfathers, long ago, when they spoke with animals. Their smoke still floated, touching the morning prayers. Grandfathers, grandmothers, sons and daughters, me, us, the mountains and animals, covered with the morning pollen.